How long is the Great Tribulation? Well, it may depend on which tribulation you're talking about. But looking at the book of Revelation, let's see when the period ends. If you compare the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, and look at the end of each of these cycles of 7 judgments, around the 6th or the 7th judgment in the series, you have something that kind of looks like the end of the age. It's catastrophic, stars falling to the earth, mountains and islands being removed from their places, and so forth. Well, are these the sort of events that happen every other Monday? Some of you may feel that way, Monday morning going back to work, but no, these are cataclysmic type events. Well, when does the period start? The end seems to be the end of the age, but when does the period start? Well, here's how long it's said to be: 1,260 days, time times and half a time, and 42 months, so about 3.5 years. And you can add all the 3.5 years up together in the book of Revelation and get maybe 10.5 years, or you can see that maybe they're all talking about the same time frame. Now, this time frame is borrowed from the book of Daniel, time times and half a time, 1,290 days there, where it's the final half of the 70th week, without getting into a lot of detail, the 70th 7 of years, or the last 3.5 years of 490 years. So I don't want to get into a lot of detail on that. But the language is taken from the book of Daniel. Now the question is, does Revelation mean the same thing by this as Daniel does? Well, he might not. But I'm going to give an interpretation that's very common among scholars, but is not so common on a popular level. So at least you can be exposed to it and see what you think. But Revelation often reapplies Old Testament symbols. If Revelation is reapplying the symbol, what end-time picture would he have in mind? So saying, if this is a reapplication to mean something different than what it meant in Daniel, which, again, Revelation often reapplies things like the plagues in Exodus. He's not giving you a discourse on those plagues. He's speaking of plagues like those in Exodus. He calls the great city, the city where our Lord was crucified, but he also calls it Babylon, he calls it Sodom, he calls it Egypt. Geographically, these weren't all in the same place, so some symbolic language is going on here. If it's symbolic here, what end-time picture would it mean? Well, Daniel was speaking of a period of great tribulation, and so Revelation would also be speaking, presumably in a symbolic way, of a period of great tribulation, but he might not designate the same length of time. If you look at the end time elsewhere in the New Testament, what's it talking about? Well, actually, elsewhere in the New Testament, like Acts chapter 2 and verse 17, in the last days, says God, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. Did he start the last days and now we're later than last days, but it doesn't count as last days? Did he pour out the Spirit and then pour the Spirit back again? 1 Timothy 4:1, 2 Timothy 3:1, 2 Peter 3:3 all speak of the last days, of the last times, and speak of that as the time in which the author and the reader or readers are living. Romans 8:22 uses the familiar Jewish language or imagery of the birth pangs of the Messiah, the birth pangs of the New Age. Says creation is groaning and travailing right now. 1 John 2:18 is another example of this. You've heard that an Antichrist is coming. Even now, there are already many Antichrists. 2 Thessalonians 2 speaks of a future man of lawlessness, but then says the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. So which kind of tribulation is he talking about here? Well, again, Revelation rarely takes over Jewish end-time symbols, including those from the Old Testament, without reapplying them in what we know about Jesus. Also, Revelation is full of symbolic numbers. Even probably Daniel's Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel's 3 friends and Daniel were tested for 10 days with the king's food. Well, in Revelation 2:10, guess what? the people of Smyrna, the believers in Smyrna, will be tested for 10 days. It's probably a reapplication of the language of Daniel. Well, Daniel himself, Daniel itself, the book of Daniel, reapplies Jeremiah's 70 years prophecy as Daniel prays about it and finds out, no, this is ultimately 70 sabbatic years. It's going to be 490 years before you get the full restoration that's promised. You get some at the 70, but mostly you're looking at 490 years. Well, if Daniel could reapply under the inspiration of the Spirit the chronology of Jeremiah, then Revelation could also, by the Spirit, reapply the chronology of the book of Daniel. Well, that's all a nice idea. What evidence do we have that it might be something different here than the precise figure of 3.5 years that was met in Daniel? In other words, a symbolic, Christologically reapplied frame of time between the first coming and the second coming. Well, Jesus talked about tribulation in Daniel being fulfilled within a generation. And in fact, 40 years after he spoke it, 3.5 years of Jerusalem being under siege was completed with Jerusalem's and the temple's destruction. So Revelation most likely is written after the destruction of Jerusalem. Most scholars and early church fathers seem to date Daniel in the 90s. So over 20 years, 2 decades after Jerusalem's destruction. That being the case, then, he wouldn't be referring to the exact time frame that Daniel was referring to, but something like what Daniel meant. If you look in Revelation chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, this is what actually convinces me that this is probably the right interpretation. Daniel chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, Jesus is caught up to heaven to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And then this woman flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days, which means that the beginning of this time frame seems to be Jesus' exaltation. So it runs from the first coming to the second coming. That's not to say that there's not a future intensification of tribulation. It's to say that, well, it's of a kind with the rest of this age where believers can suffer and experience different kinds of tribulation in this age, often persecution in many parts of the world. Also, at the same time, the accuser of the brothers and sisters is cast down. Satan is cast out of heaven. He no longer can accuse us before the Father. Now, I believe that's already true, that Satan can't accuse us because Jesus is our intercessor before the Father. And if he's for us, who can bring a charge against us? Also, it says that salvation and the kingdom come at this time. Well, that'll happen at the second coming. But this isn't referring to the second coming. This is referring to something before Satan is cast down and comes down with wrath on the earth. So, more than likely, Revelation 12 is not speaking just of a future 3.5 years, literally, of tribulation, but it's applying that to the whole course of this age. And that means it has a great message for us, like what Jesus said in John chapter 16, verse 33. In this world you will have great tribulation, but be of good courage. I have overcome the world.